Hi, welcome to the Acceptto Intellyx WebEx. We are going to be getting started in just 1 minute. We're just waiting for a few stragglers to join. I will begin the presentation shortly. Thank you. Okay, let's get started then. My name is Bill Anderson. I head up marketing at Acceptto, and this is the first of our ongoing series of educational webinars on what's happening in the identity and access management market, more specifically as it relates to authentication. Today's webinar is on behavioral authentication, what it can do for you specifically. And it's hosted by Acceptto and by Intellyx. The logistics for today are going to be that all attendees will be on mute, but we will have an interactive Q&A at the end of the event. So please use the chat window, and I will use those questions at the end for a moderated Q&A. So we look forward to some interaction at the end of our presentation. From an agenda perspective, I'm going to start out by introducing our illustrious speakers, and then we'll turn it over to Intellyx, and Jason will provide you with a background of how we got here and a brief timeline of authentication. And then we'll turn it over to Acceptto, and Shahrokh will talk about binary versus continuous authentication, and more importantly, the rise of biobehavioral, or more specifically, behavioral authentication. And as I mentioned, we'll end up with a Q&A session. So our speakers today bring a tremendous wealth of experience, not only in security, but specifically in identity authentication and the markets that we are talking about specifically today, which is behavioral authentication. Our first speaker will be Jason English. He's a principal analyst and the CMO of Intellyx. He brings over 25 years of enterprise experience and specifically covers digital transformation, DevOps, AI, hybrid IT, cloud, cyber, Internet of Things, etc. And you see Jason's social media and website there. You'll certainly get a better feel for what Intellyx can bring to your companies by way of industry data. Shahrokh is the CEO of Acceptto, and he also brings over 27 years of technology leadership experience and has over 20 issued and pending patents. He's led multiple billion-dollar projects in Intel and is one of the founders and leaders at Acceptto and really driving the next phase of authentication. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jason, who will kick off our presentation.
All right, thanks, Brian. Okay, thanks. Well, first of all, thanks everyone for joining me and Shahrokh on this webinar today. A little bit about Intellyx. Intellyx is an industry analyst firm focused on customer-driven, technology-empowered digital transformation in the enterprise. Now, we cover disruptive trends within enterprise IT, from mainframes to artificial intelligence, DevOps to digital process automation, and the new containery network edges and security that keep it all running. However, instead of focusing on technology itself or ranking vendors, Intellyx raises the discussion to a broad business context that connects the dots for an audience of business and IT professionals alike. So we have a massive collection of thought leadership content out on Intellyx.com, as well as appearing in several external publications and events, and of course, on Twitter and LinkedIn and all that good stuff. So what's on tap for today? Well, we're going to talk about a timeline of authentication and how the progression of this practice has informed our modern day highly mobile user experience. Authentication is the process of determining who should and who shouldn't be authorized to enter or stay within a given location, or in software terms, who has credentials to enter and use a given application. So I like showing this door knocker here because authentication used to be this physical kind of thing that a human gatekeeper would manage. You would have to like make the special knock to get inside the castle, or say some secret word to get into the speakeasy in the 20s. So people would have to physically recognize your badge or uniform as authorization that you belong inside that place. So in historical terms, today's software-driven authentication is a blip in the timeline of how long we've been using some form of that, but it's evolving very fast, and so are the threats. So now, with the majority of internet traffic and application usage on mobile devices, hackers are going mobile first in their targeting attempts. So securing apps and data on devices isn't as simple as security in the old days, where we had most of the important processes and data behind a firewall in the data center. Now the edge is everywhere. Users have a mobile endpoint, and they are doing work and buying things over cellular networks and public Wi-Fi. So we start out with the good old username and password key pair. It's been with us pretty much since the dawn of software security. It's better than nothing, I guess. Your IT department can require the employees to like change their logins, or the app can require ever more complex passwords and more frequent changes. But the issue here is really a user failure. I mean, you can't blame people for not remembering so many passwords. And you can't see why they don't just use the same password everywhere, or stick a password post-it note on the screen like Michael Scott from The Office. Or, of course, you can put them all on a spreadsheet or post them into a shared drive or Dropbox or Box or whatever. But one thing's clear: passwords aren't getting it done, and they're not much fun to type on a small screen either. So I'll kind of gloss over the idea of hardware solutions and dongles, but in some way, these are like an extension of the old employee badges and key cards. In the 80s and 90s, lots of expensive software would come with this dongle. It could plug into your parallel port, or later the serial port, or the USB port, and it was your license to use a system. And that was kind of draconian by old terms, but we also saw this PIN or password generator come into being, or people would carry this with them and use it to enter their secure devices. But ultimately, the need for this adjunct device, or having some other item with you at all times just to log in, frustrates a lot of users. In addition, you could lose it, and someone else could get a hold of it. It's very expensive to replace. So it doesn't mean that these disappeared entirely. We now have similar authenticator apps on our devices themselves. So smartphones have like Google Authenticator and other apps like that. And so it still exists in today's parlance, but we'll just cover more on that later. And then next, you enter the password manager phase. These started out, you remember when you had like Windows apps that would hold on to all of your various passwords, and then later browser extensions. And now most browsers just offer a native password manager right on board. So if you're using Safari or uh, Chrome, you'll see that it automatically suggests or and saves passwords for you. And there's still higher performance ones that are built for companies. For instance, Okta, I've used in the past, and it manages and changes passwords in the background. And it can do this across all of your employee users and all of the apps. And that's pretty cool. However, you need broad adoption of such practices to make it work right. Everyone has to use it for all the apps, and they need to have very secure master passwords. Now, that's especially hard if you're dealing with consumers, to get them to adopt something like that or to use it appropriately. And when it comes to devices, once that password manager is compromised, if someone gets past that, or if you're already logged in, for instance, hackers can have the keys to the whole kingdom at that point. And two-factor authentication, that came into vogue in the 2000s, more later in the previous decade, more after smartphones started appearing everywhere. But pretty much any phone that could support text was fair game for a while, and you started seeing a lot more, text validation than SMS validation. It really grew in prominence when the NSA had strongly recommended it for all computer users, and you saw a lot of apps that would require this second confirmation step. Sometimes they used to do it via email. That's not really new, but um, mostly via text or SMS messages straight to the device, and you'd use that, type it back into your application to get in. Now, At first, this worked pretty well for security. It could be a bit of a pain if you're working in one app and then you have to go and get a code from some text and remember it long enough to enter it into this original screen. And they found better workarounds for that to help you maybe copy or reuse the code you get. But the real problem here is that the text or SMS message itself is served to you by your telco company or by the carrier. And so they weren't really prepared to be systematically or socially hacked by a lot of different attacks. And so hackers got really good at sending spoof messages to customers that look like the real thing coming from their carrier or from their bank, telling them to log in and check something or look at some problem. And when that stopped being working anymore, they started actually hijacking customers' mobile accounts, and they would just call in and say, "Hey, I'm John Q. Public. Give me access to your uh, this mobile account of Verizon or AT&T or something like that." And using that, they could eventually get a SMS password reset and get into some apps and basically go in through a back door and get access to all of the accounts that host might be attached to. So sensitive material was kind of not protected under that approach. I have a lot of fun with these. I wouldn't call them multi-factor authentication, but extreme factor authentication or XFA. So all of these XFA approaches, they resemble Ninja Warrior courses to me. The app puts the user through a series of difficult hurdles that only a real human should be able to do. Now, this started with the warpy captchas, where you have to try and read this very warped text in under 30 seconds, or you can't get in. And then later, Google and others came up with the street sign or car recognition tools where you have to look at this screen, figure out basically by recognizing images what it is. Now, all of these obstacle courses, they make for terrible UX for busy users. And worst of all, many of the XFA hurdles are not usable at all by physically impaired or disabled users. So if they might be blind or have some problem with their hands or other disabilities, they had to put in workarounds. And guess what? The hackers have exploited users there as well. On the authorization side, they added stuff like this: send in my utility bill to this address, or get on a video cam. And these were especially prominent when there was some sort of KYC or anti-money laundering workflow, like in the banking scenario. Now, that's not software authentication, but it does add to this overall burden of having to collect a lot of data and personal information for users, and that creates a lot of storage and labor on the back end for the business. So there's lots of costly support calls when you put obstacles like this in front of users. They're trying to call to get in through normal means, and that's really not what we're looking for. Now, even more current are the idea of mobile biometrics, and these are really cool in this Mission Impossible sort of way. Later model phones they started embedding fingerprint readers, and then cameras are becoming higher resolution, offering facial recognition. And we even have software now that can read voices to help contribute to this biometric data. And they take a print of, if it's your fingerprint or if it's your voice print or it's looking at your face. And these can be pretty convenient because you can kind of do it while you're in the process of using an application if it puts the challenge in the same place as the application use. And then users can just scan or fingerprint and then they can continue on from there. The thing is, these don't work on a lot of devices. They have to be obviously the more current ones. And sometimes they depend upon a certain environment. So if your original picture was at a certain lighting mode, or your voice is recorded in a noisy or quiet area, if it's dark or cold and dry or windy, that user may be out of luck getting in, and then you're back to that problem where they're calling in to the for support calls. So this particular space, it still has a long way to go. I mean, there's a lot of promise here, but in order to be tolerant enough to work, so that it's not offering false positives or failing every time, this biometric data has to be really boiled down until it's really not much more secure than a 6-digit password. We have to do better than that. So, what do all the above methods have in common? Well, they're all still productively in use today. All of them can be useful as part of a complete authentication workflow. You always have some use for better, stronger passwords, multi factor authentication. What they do also have in common, they're also binary authentications. So you're either in or you're out. You know, at the point that you enter the app, you're in, you're authorized, and then what happens? Well, what if there was a way to do this continuously? I mean, what if we could address the scenario where your phone is stolen from a cafe and you're still logged in? Or if your kid picks it up and they start trying to email your boss while you're busy with something else? Or say a phone is fully compromised by a hacker and the attacker is waiting for the right time to assume control and start the malicious behavior when you're not even holding the phone. Now, this is where we get to the concept of biobehavioral authentication. So rather than work by gathering personal data or presenting these XFA hurdles to the user, we can look at the way that users actually are using their devices, the way people use devices, without the constant obstacles or personal data gathering. But I think continuous biobehavioral authentication is really not my place to cover here. I'm sure Brian will mention it, but I've written a little concise paper on the above. If you're curious, you can get it on our site at Intellyx.com or obviously over at Acceptto's site, or they'll send you a link after this webinar anyway. So let us know if you have any questions during this webinar. You know, please feel free to ask in the chat area, or look us up after the show for more content. And with that, I'm ready to pass it to Brian and Shahrokh. So take it away.
So Shahrokh, you're up.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jason and Brian. I think the summary of what Jason said is I captured in a couple bullets before I move on into what Acceptto is all about and what continuous authentication and biobehavioral means and what it can do for you. Number one, we see an evolution of access management over the last 4 or 5 decades, which has got us to a point that now the perimeter doesn't exist anymore and the passwords, as Jason pointed out, are not that fun. Extreme MFA also, actually later on in the slides I show you, as a joke, they have an 11-factor authentication system as well for those people who believe in friction and they love friction and they want to basically have no access, if possible, to their users. But the extreme MFA is also has a lot of friction. Now, so what is the solution? To give you an overview and give you Acceptto at a glance, there are 3 things that you need to know about us that hopefully you can capture and remind yourself every time that you're thinking about identity access management and authentication and authorization and protecting your assets. Number 1 is what we do what we call cognitive continuous authentication. Cognitive continuous authentication leverages the behavioral and biobehavioral signals of the user and uses our single sign-on and other single sign-on as well if that's what the customers need, and combines it with the traffic intelligence, and the combination of the traffic intelligence, the user behavior, and the single sign-on all together will allow us to vectorize hundreds of signals as a way of authenticating the person and verifying that they are who they claim they are, as well as looking at their digital DNA when they log in. How we do it is very simple. We leverage a mixture of what we call expert systems. And these are a set of expert systems in machine learning, and also there is human element into it because you need to have both supervised and unsupervised machine learning in order to be able to control and manage false positives. And what we do is we allow a real-time risk score associated with each individual transaction at any given time and identify any type of risk pre-authentication, at authentication, and most importantly, post-authorization. In order to do that, we have a group of modules, including our risk engine, our mobile app, which has itself a number of modules, including analytics on their mobile and location-based services. We also take advantage of a device and browser DNA and fingerprinting, where we recognize the good users and identify them, and combined with their habits, we allow them to have a frictionless entry into the system. And then post-authorization, we monitor if anything bad that is supposed to happen, such as phishing attacks and account takeovers. We can then terminate them and usher the user either to the door and exit them out of the session, or require additional authentication. Why we do it is very simple. Again, I go back to what Jason pointed out. Passwords are not fun. Extreme MFAs are a lot of friction and a hassle. And even with all the extreme friction and extreme MFA and 2FA, and in general, any binary authentication, enterprises are getting breached one after the other. And the problem is that the authentication does not stop at the gate. Next slide, please. So one of the key things that you have to remember is, we all have to remember, is that you have to assume that all of your credentials have already been breached. And there's a good reason for that, to make that assumption. The assumption is based on the fact that the platforms that hold your credentials, even credentials that you haven't yet provided, are already breached. There are three factors here. The perimeter no longer exists, and the perimeter is now the cloud. The passwords that are compromised and you don't know about them yet are going to one day be released to the dark web and in the hands of bad guys. And even those credentials, as I mentioned earlier, that you haven't created are already breached because of the system being breached. That's not only the two problems. The main problem is all the evil happens actually post-authorization. Post-authorization is where all the abuse and hacking and all the data and privacy, private information of the consumers and employees of an enterprise are being compromised, and therefore huge damage to the enterprise and to the public as well. Now, you have the choice of going back to extreme factors to create a solution that will allow you will prevent anybody to get in. And this comes back to having a extreme MFA in place and add enough friction that nobody can get to the account. And as a joke, we do have April 1st video about our 11-factor solution, that if we can just play the video, it would be fun to watch it and see how 11-factor authentication works together. Here's a typical user. Oh, the video is not working.
Yeah, sorry, we're going to send the video after the webinar.
Okay, no problem. Okay, next slide. So Jason brought up the word binary authentication. Basically, binary authentication, if you think about it, is something that it is either you're in or out. These type of binary authentication are things that you're very familiar with. Your passwords is a password is a binary authentication. You either have it or you don't have it. A two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication is a binary authentication, and you have seen from phishing attacks that these things can be attacked and worked around. In fact, actually, NIST in 2016 announced that two-factor authentications through SMS are problematic and are not safe. Biometric is a very interesting thing. Jason, you mentioned something about biometric and the fact that it is advancing, and especially with the advance of mobile devices and the capabilities of the 3D cameras and whatnot, it's getting better and better. The main problem with biometrics is that by themselves, they are insufficient, because at some point, biometrics will also be breached. The biometrics are very similar to your license plate on your car. It's a public knowledge. The moment that you wave your hand and somebody with an iPhone, 8 and after takes your picture, your fingerprints are gone, right? And as you pointed out, Jason, this is not, biometrics are not as, at best, they're at a 5-digit level of a PIN as far as the security goes in, and they're not very reliable. And since they cannot get reset, it's problematic. Traffic analytics is fantastic. It gives you some level of knowledge, but that's not enough, and is not fully reliable, because people can spoof and hack the systems in order to look like the different traffic that you expect, and you have whitelisted. So what is the solution? The solution is the future of identity and access management is in behavioral authentication. Behavioral authentication is a solution that most solution providers today are ignoring, and the reason is that vectorizing these signals and the behaviors is a very complex function, but it is a very rewarding behavior for being used in authentication. Because people can take your passwords, can take your biometric, but they cannot take your behavior and the graph and the continuity that you have in your life. Now, how does this work? The way it works is, I mentioned that we have a mixture of expert systems. In this dial, the center of this dial is the mixture of experts, including the machine learning engines that we have, and as well as the organic element of it, which are the experts and InfoSec people who take a look at anomalies when something goes wrong in real time. In order to make the system perfect, you need to ingest data from different sources. And what we do is we ingest and fuse the data both from the logical and the physical data together in order to calculate the risk associated with each transaction. This type of contextual data fusion allows us to calculate the risk at any given time for any transaction at an individual level, or at the group level. And it also allows us to not only stop at the time of authentication, but create a user unified journey from enrollment through the life cycle, including the call centers, authentication, and then pre-auth intelligence, and as a result, be able to do a context-aware and risk-based authentication. And most importantly is post-authorization. As I pointed out, all the evil happens post-authorization. If somebody has already got into the system, let's say that it is actually an employee with a legitimate credentials, but the employee can actually do damage to the enterprise by taking over data that is not relevant to their work and sharing it with public domain or with the bad guys. So it's not only about the good guys stay always good. It's sometimes on purpose, or sometimes without having an intent, they can damage and pose risks to the enterprise. Okay. I think that's net. I think what I like to leave you with is the concept of continuous authentication is the future, and using behavioral analytics allows us to detect anomalies, reduce the friction for the good users, and allow the good users to enjoy a frictionless security while we create friction for the bad guys or in doubt users. Back to you, Brian.
So thanks, Shahrokh. Thanks, Jason. Really appreciate the insight you've given us on, kind of how we got here in the journey from passwords all the way through to behavioral authentication. We do have a few questions I'd like to basically just address to you guys as experts. The first one, Shahrokh, we'll have you start with. Is authentication more about keeping the bad guys out, or is it about keeping the customers in?
Actually, that's a very good question. It really is not just keeping the bad guys out or making the good guys having a good access and to the assets that belongs to them with or without friction, regardless of friction or not. It's about protection of the assets. Protection in cyber, unlike most people who are focused on authentication only, is not just about the perimeter protection. It's mostly about once the person is inside, what they're doing and what type of assets are they accessing, what applications do they run, what data are they downloading, and what is being shared from one device to the other device. You can't just assume that one person is a good guy and another one is a bad guy, because as I was just mentioning, there's a possibility that somebody who is a good guy by mistake or without any intent does something that is damaging to the enterprise. It's about recognizing that binary authentication is the way of past and detecting that the risk during the session as well. So it is not about keeping the bad guys out or keeping the good guys in. It's about detecting anomalies and detecting the behavior and the intent. Detection of the behavior and determining the intent is a very, very interesting topic in machine learning and in behavioral analytics. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Shahrokh, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think at the end of the day, if you are building an application, the primary purpose is to serve customers, right? So you want to make that as frictionless as possible, and that the customer orientation is really the main driver for delivering any functionality. Now, obviously, if you're exploited in any way through this process, then it becomes that becomes the ultimate drawback. And it seems like a lot of end customers, they don't seem to care about whether or not they're being continuously authenticated until they have a problem, right? That makes it very hard to position these kind of solutions unless you can really just turn this into overall improving the whole customer experience and then managing risks as they come in. So if you're able to do biobehavioral authentication, you can actually see this kind of risk posture of all of the usage behaviors that are going through that application. We know today that jailbreaks of devices are happening more and more frequently. People are even downloading random apps from app stores, and they're finding exploited banking apps and other things that are basically spoofing their access and then getting control to other adjacent services. And we need to stop that, right? So that's definitely a big priority. I appreciate your insight there.
Actually, I want to add something. You mentioned something that most users, they want to get into data, but there is a amplified need for higher level of security in cyber this is actually, the contrast is dialing up as we go forward. Just in the last few days, there was an announcement of approximately 20 million people's from one of the healthcare organizations or the processing company of them, almost 20 million people records were compromised. And there's a fear about the fact that people's health records are also compromised. So the majority of the community in cyber are getting very sensitive to how careless the organizations are with their data, especially when it comes to their personal data, their financial data, and their the hassle of account takeovers. So there is a increased urgency for organizations to pay more attention to security and privacy of the data. And I think that users actually will follow and will welcome some sort of a analytics behind this to prevent the bad guys and make the access management frictionless for the good guys. They're already doing that, but the benefit goes to the marketing agencies, right? All of your data and all of your information and all of your habits and your clickstream data is going through different organizations like Google and others to these marketing agencies. Why not use it why not use the behavioral analytics for protecting the privacy and security of the masses?
You know, that brings up a great segue to the next question. In fact, I'll start this one with Jason, because, you know, as we know, it's difficult for companies to evaluate new technologies, and you know, there's this kind of negative inertia to want to change. But Jason, what are your thoughts on some of the KPIs companies should measure themselves against here, specifically for results, and what value do they tend to overlook most often?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question here. I think a lot of companies, you know, they obviously they're looking at their revenue stream, and they're looking at the overall, you know, productivity of their releases. So they're looking at efficiency from a development level, as well as the ability to have throughput of customers. I think what they often underestimate is the potential support costs that are created by some of these methodologies, right? So the more hurdles you put in front of customers, you know, the more ejection of, you know, you'll have people abandoning carts, you'll have them leaving their accounts, so they'll go on to use other better applications. If, for instance, they do feel like they're not secure, or if they're having difficulties and they're constantly having to call support. So, you know, I would really look at this. If you look at the total cost of having a solution like this, you really want to look at you know, that support and labor cost, and how much potential issue management resolution would you have to do if your data was breached and so many records got out. And the second one I'd say would be, especially for a lot of companies, they have to deal with serious, you know, regulatory and compliance issues. For instance, with GDPR or personal information in banking, or, you know, you know, there's new regulations coming along all the time, like HIPAA HIPAA happened in healthcare. And so you have to look at what kind of data you're storing on these users. And so if you're actually storing their personal information, as well as even their, you know, you're storing their fingerprints or other biometric information on them, that may not play well with some of the regulations that are emerging in the privacy space. So it's also worth looking at the compliance cost as you move into this area.
Shahrokh,
If I may ask, I think there are a couple of things that the same way from the consumer side or the employee side, there's this unified journey of mobile, web, and workstation experience. From the enterprise side, one of the KPIs is, do we have a unified solution that provides the ultimate single sign-on and also post-authorization monitoring, right? In average, according to Gartner, a typical CISO or CSO has north of 45 platforms in order to harden their cybersecurity and provide protection around the perimeter that they have. Having a single solution across multiple segments of mobile, web, and basically your desktop and your workstation will allow them to save a lot of money because, as Jason pointed out, from customer calls, productivity, friction, forgotten passwords, all of these will go away. There's also a big KPI for organizations to measure is how much, besides the reduction of the friction and going passwordless, is the number of account takeovers that you don't need to deal with. Account takeovers and breaches are very costly for large organizations. It can bankrupt the company. Just the recent healthcare issue, actually, I think it was yesterday that it was announced that the breach that happened on LabCorp and another healthcare diagnostic company, the organization that was managing their billing, and they got breached. They actually filed Chapter 11 yesterday or the day before yesterday. So the brand name issue here is also a big deal, right? If people have can protect the damage that comes in with a breach with a solution that is performing, it's a good KPI to keep, right? And what if you are breached? As I said, assume that you're breached. And what you want to do is make the breach benign by the fact that, well, you don't have to worry about it. It's not only about your password. That makes sense, Jason? Anything that
completely.
you want to add?
Yeah, that's definitely a very positive approach to it, and it's a matter of adoption, right? You have to have net adoption of the solution across the entire workforce. If you're in an enterprise sense, or a work in customer force, if you're partnering with other companies as well. So yeah,
if you
yep.
Yeah, if you're a financial institution and your customer is spending 1 minute of the 3 minutes that they want to get into their account into resetting their password, remembering their password, getting into it, or going through the extreme factors to get in and get out, that 1 minute is 33% of their eyeballs and their attention to something that the financial institution services that the financial institution can deliver to the consumer. The same thing about the regular employees. So there is that productivity element and the amount of time that is wasted on bad binary solutions that exist today.
Yeah, this actually tees up the next question, which is if an organization is ready to go this route, how broad is the range of devices for a biobehavioral authentication approach? I mean, that we could actually support something like that. Shahrokh, do you want to start that one?
That's actually a tough question to answer, but I'll try, because it's not an issue of how many type of devices. The biobehavioral is graphing basically behavior of the good users and classifying them as good users. And it's not only limited to devices. So the person who asked the question, I just want to emphasize that it's not about only the devices. It's also the behavior of the person and normality and abnormality of it. Obviously, this is a very compute intensive and graphing the behavior of the person and anonymizing it, and at the same time being able to provide a risk score. But to just answer the question directly, if the question is how many devices, look, in average, the users have a limited number of devices depending on the geo that they're in. For example, in North America, in an 18 to 24 month period, interval, the users have at tops 5 devices. This is, if you think about it, with the replacement cycles and upgrades and the fact that you lose your phone and you change your laptop, let's say that you go through 2 laptops in 2 years, right? 2 mobile phones. You're one of those guys that you change your device at least once every 2 years, and you are working for work versus one of them gets upgraded in the 18 to 24 months. So, and then you say that you have a tablet on top of all of that. So net, you'll have up to 5 devices. If the question is about unique devices that we can identify versus how many devices, what type of devices, and how unique each device, whether every device that we see can be uniquely identified. Well, a Mac is a Mac, and if you buy exact same 2 Macs or get it as a present, and your twin brothers, and you receive it from your grandparents, you're going to get the identical device, and the fingerprint of that device is the same. It's not just the device. It is the combination of the device, it is the fingerprint of the browser, it is hundreds of vectorized signals that help us to come up with a derived biobehavioral credentials. So it's not just the uniqueness of the device and what type of OS it has and what size of font it's set and what canvas it has, but it is about the biobehavioral, which is what the word biobehavioral that we use is the behavior of the user used as the dynamic biometric of the user. And it's basically a graph. So for that reason, it's an issue of digital DNA than the number of devices. I hope that I answered, just guessing what the question was about, both on the number of devices. In average, it's 5 devices, it's that much that anybody has, which can be easily fingerprinted. But as far as the behavior of the person and hundreds of signals that are vectorized in order to feed into our risk engine, that's basically what the key technique is here.
Yeah, so you're saying it's more about what you're doing with the applications than having an application itself that's checking, right? So it's really what users are doing that creates an imprint, and that is anonymous. So it's not like biometric data where I'm storing fingerprints or retina scans and things like that. It's really it's like a set of data points that kind of it doesn't profile your personal information. It just profiles how you use the applications, right?
You said it very well. It's graphing your normality, independent of capturing the data about exactly where you are and who you are. It's about this particular user ID is this a normal behavior and is this score, right? The personal information is stored locally on your mobile phone and locally on your laptop and everything else. The score and the risk score is what feeds into the engine when you don't fit the graph.
Mm-hmm.
So we have time for just one last question, and it's kind of a two-parter. So the first part I'll have Jason, you address, and the second part, Shahrokh, I'll have you address. So the first part is, we've talked about the line between in and out and binary authentication, but what really is going to be the driver for companies to really need to move to continuous authentication today? That one I'll have you, Jason, address. And then for Shahrokh, the second part is Acceptto clearly does more with this continuous approach, but how does this kind of solution interact with other tools that might do endpoint level monitoring, threat response, or find network and API call problems, or even OS level hacks, memory leaks, jailbreaks, etc. on the phone? How is that different? So Jason, why don't you start on why continuous today, and then Shahrokh can tie it up.
Yeah. I definitely don't like to be a constant predictor of doom, but I do believe, what Shahrokh was saying at the beginning, that you could assume that all of your credentials have been hacked already, and we're seeing that every day. The amount of data dumps and breached personal identity information is increasing. We see it being used in new, more sophisticated forms of attacks, like ransomware, and this constant, ability to, maybe encrypt all the files on your device or delete things and threaten people and have them pay with Bitcoin or Monero or whatever. So, and we're seeing a lot of these really, very frightening behaviors that seem to be very widespread. And, I don't know how much good it does to continue, ringing the bell when it's so clearly being heard in the marketplace right now. But I hope we don't see the kind of incidents that would be seriously hurting people beyond that. But I think really that's what's at the end of the day, that's what's going to drive it too. I mean, people are going to finally say, you know, hey, I've settled for this long enough. I've seen how my personal data is being misused, both commercially and in other ways. And I think you'll start to see a larger adoption, and that'll be driven mostly by companies that really take a customer-centric view to how they want to deliver applications and deliver the security experience. Will they'll promote that. They'll make that part of their value that they're offering to the end customers. And so I think that's how the shift is really going to happen is companies deciding, you know, hey, I'm going to differentiate myself based on this, you know, better and more secure experience.
If I may add before I switch to my section, I think you said something that actually triggered some thoughts in my head, and the word is settled. Till the day that the CISOs and the CFOs and the CEOs and CSOs are settled with the solutions that have been provided for the last 4 decades, it continues the breach. The daily breaches continues. When an organization files bankruptcy after a breach, and lawsuits come in because of not being compliant with privacy and security laws enforced by our governments, whether you're Chinese government or US or German, right? It makes no difference. Till that time, really, the majority of people are going to be settled and comfortable with what solution they have. And the reason is because all of them have the traditional solutions and providers that provide security and have been providing security for the last 2 or 3 decades, or at least 1 decade, right? 1 decade to 3 decades, right? The problem is there is a need for a paradigm shift, and hopefully companies like ours, once we set the paradigm shift and we show the early adopters that there is an alternative and a better solution that will reduce the friction, reduce the risk, and improve the user experience, and gives you a better knowledge of an audit of everything that is happening in your system at a much lower cost. Hopefully, this will result in the traditional providers of the solutions to step up and do better than what they have been doing, selling 10-year-old technologies. And then also those who are settled with status quo will wake up, because once companies go bankrupt, CEOs and boards will decide that we will give more budget to IT, and we do need to have an initiative for perhaps 2020 to go passwordless and more secure and protecting our users and our consumers' data.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, it should be the #1 concern of any major enterprise, I would say. But and you are starting to see more of that discussion at a high level being, you know, driven down from the board, because yes, if you fail in this aspect, that's the consequences. It becomes a board level issue for anybody who's responsible for it.
Yeah, I actually, everywhere I go, I talk about that our priority needs to be cyber, land, air, and sea. And the reason is because fundamentally the lowest barrier to entry to any enterprise and any country, let's talk about the country's security and privacy and protection. Cyber is one of the most dangerous things here as far as being unprotected today. In spite of good efforts by DoD and other agencies, still we are very much exposed against foreign threats and the bad guys and the threat actors. And really this requires a combination of public sector and the private sector together to step up and adopt new technologies.
Perfect. Well, thank you both for your incredible insights, both Jason and Shahrokh. by way of logistics for post-webcast, we will have a recording of this available to everybody, so you can pass it around to your coworkers and your peers. As Jason mentioned earlier, there is a new white paper available. You can find that on the Acceptto website at www.acceptto.com. It'll be a link on the homepage, and you also can find it on the Intellyx website as well, as you saw. This presentation will also be available if you just drop us a line to the info@Acceptto email, and we can make that available to you. So with that, I'll thank you again for your time, and look forward to having you come back to another of our future webcast series.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it.
Thank you for the audience.